Thanks for having me here today. This is my first visit to this group. I'm glad to see all of you and glad to be here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a detail about myself since I'm the first time visitor here. And then I'll talk about what we'll cover too. We're going to talk about the temperature trend, the global temperature trend so far as it's been measured and observed, the applications and feedbacks in the atmosphere, which are important for making the future even hotter supposedly. The role of aerosols. Aerosols are supposedly stunting global warming, and that's why we have the 16-year pause. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Arctic sea ice decline, which many people say is proof positive that global warming exists. We'll talk about the failures of the models to predict the pause. Steve Gorham covered some of that. We'll talk about climate sensitivity, and this is the key thing. This is really it. This is what it's all about, climate sensitivity, because that really maps the way forward. We'll talk about adaptation to climate change and climate and future generations, reducing emissions, and my personal favorite, the integrity of the surface temperature record. First, a bit about me. I spent 25 years in television weather, 8 years, now 10 years in radio. I operate a company that provides weather services to other radio and television and newspapers. And I operate the most viewed website in the world on climate called What's Up With That. And I've been itching to say this since we're talking about What's Up With That. I want to say, what's up, docs? Anyway. Anyway. I'm a bit of a green guy, and long ago you could call me an environmentalist, really. I mean, that would have been my label. I was very into it. I put solar power on my home. This is actually my first solar project. I recently purchased another home and I put solar on it, which you probably saw on my blog earlier this year. I drive an electric car. This is my first model, which is just a glorified golf cart, and I'm on my second model now, which I'll have to admit I haven't been driving much anymore because after driving it for 2 years, the batteries have croaked and it cost me $2,500 to replace the battery pack, and I just don't have the cash right now. But when it was working, it was great. I put timer switches in my home to reduce my electricity consumption because in California during the summer, where I live in the middle of the valley, I get penalized for using air conditioning in the summer. Rates of up to 80-90 cents per kilowatt hour are not uncommon during the summer. I have LED lights in my home to reduce the amount of electricity I use, and they've worked out very well. I was very much on the other side of the climate debate years ago. In 1988, I remember vividly standing in the satellite feed room of my television station and watching Dr. Jim Sampson here doing his presentation before Congress, talking about the need to do something. He presented his 3 scenarios that you see here of climate, and that if we didn't do something, we were going to be in trouble in the future. Now, this moved me. As a meteorologist on the air, I thought to myself, I got to do something about this. I didn't know what it would be, but I felt like I had to educate the public. And so it got me turned into kind of an activist role to do just that. I started working as an activist in my own town. A couple of trees were going to be cut down to make a coffee shop, or actually a video shop, and I helped save those. I worked with the National Arbor Foundation in 1990 and 1991 on a program. It was an idea I had in the shower one day. I felt like, well, you know, maybe I could talk to viewers about how to mitigate climate change by planting trees. And so I flew out to Lincoln, Nebraska, and talked with the president of the National Arbor Day Foundation. And we did a program that involved television stations all over the United States to do a presentation during Arbor Day, the time around Arbor Day leading up to Earth Day. We were talking about how CO2 was a problem and how by planting trees we could offset it. And we got viewers to plant trees. They would write into the National Arbor Day Foundation and they would get these seed packets, or these trees, seedlings they called them, 5 Colorado blue spruces, and we planted over 250,000 trees each year as a result of this. I was really gung-ho about this. So what changed all that? Why am I now here in front of you talking completely about the opposite? Well, it had to do with meeting a fellow by the name of Jim Goodrich, the former state climatologist of California. He moved to my town. He had every bit of temperature data for the whole state, all the way back to pre-gold rush days. And he started doing his own independent studies, And when he did that, he started dropping papers off on my front doorstep. Literally, he'd stuff them in the mailbox. Hey, take a look at this. And so I started reading these things, and it became evident to me that there was something else going on. He was looking at temperature trends in the major cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and so forth, and then he was looking at temperature trends elsewhere in California with all this data that he had, and he found something interesting. He plotted the data for all the cities around California, and as you can see, where we have the most population, Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, Reno, temperature trends are quite high, but elsewhere, they're much smaller. They're somewhere between 0 to 0.01 or even negative in some cases, where you see the big blue dots. In 1996, he published a small article in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, and this graph was in it. And this graph was my light bulb moment. He plotted the temperature trend of counties in California between 100,000 and 1 million population. Here's the temperature trend for counties that have 100,000. Here's temperature for more populated counties, and here's the most populated counties. And I looked at that and I said to myself, wait a minute, if CO2 is the cause of all this, how does it know to heat different counties differently? It's not an intelligent molecule. So that really got me thinking that there's something else at work here, and what was at work was UHI. But there's an even bigger problem, which I'll get to. He recently updated the graph to include data all the way up to 2009, and it still holds today, although there is a little bit more in the lower population counties now. So back then, Jim and I had some brainstorms on ideas that we might do to present some of this stuff, and he'd seen some weather stations that were absurdly sited, and he showed me a couple of pictures of them in California. And we were also talking about paint, because back when I studied at Purdue University, I was a research assistant. Oh, okay, great. Go Boilermakers. Back when I studied at Purdue in the meteorology department, one of my first jobs as a research assistant as a student was to set up a thing called a Stevenson screen. That's these white wooden boxes with slats that they put the thermometer in. And I had to set up one of these, and I unpacked it from the crate that it came in. And as I unpacked it, I looked at it, and the paint was coming off in my hands. And I'm like, what? And all of the pieces were like this. And I went to my professor, and I said, look at this. The paint's coming off in my hands on this thing. What is this all about? I mean, can I repaint this with something that's, isn't messy? And he says, no, don't touch it. It's been like that since it was set up by the Weather Bureau back in 1892. Well, what do you mean? Well, it's whitewash. And that's what they've always used since the 1890s. If you change the whitewash to something else, you'll change the character of the screen's measurement. Oh, okay. I always remembered that. Well, it turns out that they changed the specification in 1979, and I'd always wondered what happened and how that might have affected temperature. So we didn't have anything to do. We had no time or funding to do anything about it at that time, so it kind of percolated in my head. And I was elected to the local school board, and all of a sudden I found myself de-elected, and I had free time on my hands. I started a blog with a local newspaper. And I got involved with a conversation with a local engineer. It got me thinking about thermometers again. And this one blog post here, In Search of the Perfect Thermometers, got me started on this whole process. And I decided that I would try the paint experiment that Jim and I had talked about back in '96. And the premise basically was that whitewash was going to be cooler because the specification changed in 1979, and now with the titanium dioxide that's the main pigment of the paint, there would be a difference. And so I set up an experimental test with slats to see if there was any small scale difference. There was. I tested it on a larger scale, actually with 3 Stevenson screens that I purchased with my own money. I spent about $5,000 to do this and set up a test facility outside my radio station, put in data loggers and NIST calibrated temperature probes. I did a complete laboratory experiment. And the results of that data showed that there were differences. There's the smooth data. And you can see the differences between the whitewash, the latex, and the bare wood control were significant. They were significant not only in the maximum temperature of the day, but also in the minimum temperature. significant differences, as much as a degree. So I thought, well, we got a real problem here. Paint hasn't been dealt with. I looked at the literature. I didn't see anything about, the switch from latex to whitewash or whitewash to latex. So I started looking around. I thought, well, let's find out and see if they've been repainted or not, if people actually follow that edict. And so I went to the nearest official climate monitoring weather station. This is at the Chico State University farm. I opened it up and I saw this. And that's electronics in there, and that is the temperature sensor hanging from the ceiling. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. Who puts electronics, heat-generating electronics, next to a thermometer just inches away? This doesn't make any sense. I thought, well, this has to be some kind of a fluke. I went to another one, which was about 30 miles west in Orland, California. This had been around since about the turn of the 20th century. And it is in perfect condition, basically. And so I thought, well, the first thing with the radio transmitter must have been a fluke. And then I discovered Marysville, California. This is the sensor right here. It's been converted to a new electronic sensor called a MMTS, or a maximum miniature temperature system, maximum minimum temperature system. But I found out later that the National Weather Service people call it the Mickey Mouse temperature system. They don't think much of it because it has its own set of problems. But what really floored me was I was standing right here looking at it. And right behind here are these two buildings. See these? These are portable buildings for this cell phone tower. There's gobs and gobs of electronics in here, and these are air conditioning units there and there, and I could feel warm air from these air conditioning units blowing on me while I was standing there taking a picture of the thermometer. And I thought to myself, this is where they're measuring climate officially? Really? No. In the parking lot? And the fire chief parked his truck right here, radiator in. So I all of a sudden now had 2 out of 3 official climate monitoring stations operated by NOAA that had what I would consider a catastrophic failure of quality control. And so I thought to myself, there must be a bigger problem going on here. So I started looking around. I started looking at the data. Sure enough, Orland in black and Marysville diverged from temperature. The Orland was the perfect station to specs, and Marysville was the one in the parking lot. And I found more. This was at the National Weather Service in Monterey. It's over Cinderstone here. And then here's another one of these MMTSs at the Agricultural Co-op in Woodland, California. It's measuring the temperature of a parking lot near the eaves. And more started showing up. And so I decided to put together a national program to survey all these stations because it had never been done before. NOAA hadn't even done it. And the premise is that if you change the conditions of the experiment during the time the experiment is being conducted, can you expect the experiment to maintain its quality throughout of data? I don't think so. So now we're going to talk about the 10 tests. And this is the temperature trend so far. Is it alarming? Now this was originally from something by Dr. Matt Ridley of England. I've adapted part of his presentation and embellished on it here. The global temperature trend is fairly modest, about 1/10 of a degree centigrade per decade since 1979. And 1979 is considered basically the starting point of modern global warming because prior to that, we'd had global cooling. We'd had 10 years of global cooling in the 70s. In fact, when James Hansen went before Congress in 1988 and talked about global warming, he had only 10 years worth of data of warming under his belt at that point when he made his claim. And that might have been part of the reason why he and his sponsor, Senator Tim Wirth, decided to turn off the air conditioning in the room that day to make it feel a little warmer. They actually talk about doing that, to do a little stagecraft to make the people being presented to get a little more concerned. Going back to 1850, we see a rise of about 1/10 of a degree, 1.4 Fahrenheit. But when you look at that, instead of looking at it as anomaly data, but the actual air temperature data, all of a sudden, it's pretty darn flat. There is a little bit of a rise, a discernible rise. There's also a discernible dip right there, but it's not, and when you look at it in a way that humans normally view temperature, particularly alarming. But when you look at it as anomaly graphs, which use a 30-year base period, which, by the way, is by the choice of the researcher. There's no standard for choosing a base period. You can choose any base period you want. You can make things look pretty alarming. This graph, Steve Gorham had this graph in one of his publications, and I point out here the thin red line, which is the deviation of global warming over the last several years, compared to the average daily maximum and min of Chicago, Illinois, and the extent of records. It's fairly small. It's almost imperceptible to human conditions. In fact, if we didn't have climatologists around to point it out, we'd probably not notice it normally. So the rate of temperature change is well below the detection threshold of humans, and the graphs depicted are all statistical constructs. These anomaly graphs are all statistical constructs. They are not the absolute temperature. They are a statistical construct of temperature. And the surface temperature record has major issues. Amplifications and feedbacks. Do they perform as advertised? Some people say they do. Some people say that they're already there and they're making things worse and that global warming is accelerating. In the paper Doran et al. 2002, climate models generally predict amplified warming in the polar regions. And this map here from NASA shows what they perceive as the problem. But everything is not as it seems. The analysis of the surface temperature data by latitude over periods of time show that, yes, we've had two periods where the poles between the high latitudes right here, 70 and 90 north, had an increase in temperature. But I'll point out that they don't have thermometers sitting on the ice, not until recently anyway, up at the North Pole. There is no long-term temperature trend for about 80 degree north up to 90 degree north. It doesn't exist. So this is all interpolated data. It's all guesswork. But during the period of 44 to 76, when we had global cooling, the poles cooled much faster than the rest of the world. And so it just basically seems that the polar regions are more sensitive to it. Either way you go, that it's not necessarily only sensitive to warming. Water vapor feedback. A water vapor feedback loop will cause accelerated global warming, Professor Andrew Dessler in 2009. Basically, it's a vicious cycle. Air temperature increases, it evaporates more water, the water is a better greenhouse gas, it makes the temperature go up, increases the temperature, and so forth and so on, ad infinitum. Well, the IPCC, when they do their modeling, they say this portion of the projected warming is due to feedbacks, and this portion is due to carbon dioxide. But when you look at the water vapor in the atmosphere as measured by radiosondes at different levels, from 300 millibars to 700 millibars, 700 millibar being closest to the surface, they're all going down since 1948. So where's the increased water vapor? Not there. The role of aerosols. Have they stunted global warming? This is a graph that shows projections of global atmospheric models along with observations. And they're claiming that this difference that you see here between projections and observations has to do with the fact that aerosols in the atmosphere have stunted the growth of global warming. And that's their excuse lately. Well, we haven't had any big volcanic eruptions in the past decade. We've had a couple, but they haven't been really earth-changing. They haven't been at the right latitude. They haven't been quite so powerful. We had a couple, El Chichon and Mount Pinatubo. They made significant impacts in global temperature, but the temperature rebounded quickly in both cases. They didn't have any long-lasting effects. And so those two volcanoes can't still be affecting us today. The aerosols can't explain the gap between model predictions and actual observations over the last 34 years, and both are pretty well understood and provide an insufficient excuse for an underperformance of the models. Negative cloud feedback leading to total feedbacks being modest is probably more likely. Arctic sea ice decline. A lot of people say this is it. This is absolute solid proof that global warming is affecting our planet. This is the tangible evidence, a lot of people say. I mean, how can you deny it is one of their common phrases. And indeed, we've had a significant decline in Arctic sea ice. But have a look right here. In 2007, we had a significant drop. We had another significant drop in 2012. But we seem to have established a new stable plateau right here where we have greater oscillations than we had in the past. But the mean seems to be fairly flat. It seems like it's reached a new equilibrium state. That's my opinion of it. But what they don't point out is that while we have Arctic sea ice declining, Antarctic ice is growing. Not much is said about this dichotomy. We only have a small amount of information in terms of the Earth's history at our disposal. The rest of it is either guesswork or interpolation. What we don't know is whether there's some kind of a bipolar dichotomy between the poles or whether it's part of a natural process. We just don't know. But we do know this, and there's photographic as well as chemical evidence that supports this. This is in Greenland. This is something called a moulin. Now this is a channel that gets carved by meltwater. And you've probably seen these pictures where meltwater is flowing down these holes in Greenland and people are alarmed because, oh my goodness, it's going to go down underneath the ice and it's going to lubricate it and the whole Greenland ice sheet is going to slide off into the ocean and we're all going to die. That's basically the premise of a lot of that alarming. The thing is that Greenland is mostly kind of a bowl shape underneath. It's not going to go anywhere. But most importantly, this black patch right here is soot. It's carbon soot from atmospheric processes that have transported it there from China, from the United States, other industrialized nations of the world. And a friend of mine in Kansas, Mike Smith, who's a certified consulting meteorologist, did an experiment a few years ago where he took some ashes, and I wish I had the picture here, but he took some ashes and he spread them out on the snow one sunny afternoon after a big snowfall. And it was just like instant melt. That little bit of carbon soot absorbed the solar radiation and melted that snow all around it. Well, that's what's happening in a lot of places in the Arctic, and there's other photos that show this. My belief is that the Arctic is more sensitive to temperature in general, as we saw with those first graphs, but also is sensitive to soot. And the Industrial Revolution has caused some man-made change in the Arctic, but I don't believe it's entirely due to CO2 or temperature. Failure of models to predict the pause. How badly did they miss? Well, this graph here has gotten a lot of press lately. It's from the data from the Climate Research Unit in the UK. It's by David Rose on the Mail on Sunday. He published this last year, and it caused quite a stir. The Met Office in the UK came out and denounced this, and then later, after reviewing their own data, they had to admit it was actually valid. That we've had really no change in the last 16 years, temperature-wise. The IPCC, in their AR5 draft, which was leaked prematurely, I had a little something to do with that, shows that the observations versus the models are also diverging. And they can't predict just a few years into the future. They're failing just about 10 years out. Dr. Roy Spencer took it further. He plotted 73 climate models and did a mean, which you see right here, versus reality, the observed temperatures, and said basically the day of reckoning has arrived. Models are failing. They're not working. So how can we trust them? And just this last week, Nature chimed in with this editorial, or this article, and they said the dramatic warming predicted after 2008 has yet to arrive. It's fair to say that the real world warmed even less than our forecast suggested. And a modeler says, we don't really understand at the moment why that is. Clearly, the models and reality don't match. Yet, we are being asked to change our economy, absorb new taxes, drop our gross domestic products, all because of something that they don't fully understand just yet. Failure of the models to predict the temperature of the last 16 years is evidence that natural factors can match man-made ones. We know there's nothing unprecedented about the level and rate of change of temperature today compared with the medieval, the Roman, and the Holocene optimum and the other post-glacial periods when carbon dioxide levels did not change during these times, but temperatures did. So if carbon dioxide is changing during those periods, what changed the temperature? Climate sensitivity. The observed sensitivity in the atmosphere is lower than projections. This graph here was done by Dr. Pat Michaels, a climatologist, former state climatologist of Virginia, who put all the different climate models together on one graph and showed how they rate. They range from 0.4 to 6C for a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. They're basically all over the place. They don't all agree. But when you plot them all together and you come up with a distribution curve, they all seem to be a little bit lower than 2. And that seems to be a factor that is now being moved to. A lot of people are going to that number now because it makes more sense based on observations. This is how we typically see temperature and carbon dioxide plotted together in the media. They basically want you to believe that there's a linear and equal relationship between temperature and CO2 in the atmosphere. This is done by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. You'll see this kind of a correlation plot all over the place. Media just loves this thing because it's simple. Everyone understands it. You put stuff in the atmosphere, the temperature goes up. End of story. They think that's all there is to it. But climate is a far, far more complex system than that. It's like soup. Now, let me give you an analogy about how carbon dioxide is like soup. You get a bowl of soup in your restaurant and you taste it and you think it's kind of bland. So you add some salt to it. And you taste it again and you think, needs a little more salt. So you add some more salt to it. But this time you oversalt it. Now you taste it and it's too salty. No matter how much more salt you add at that point, you're not going to be able to taste the difference. Your taste buds are saturated to the effect of salt. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is like that as well. There's a saturation limit for the effect of carbon dioxide. And here's a graph that you will not see published hardly anywhere. And this is a really, really important graph to look at because it shows that carbon dioxide is logarithmic rather than linear. Most of its effect is in the lower concentrations, below 250 parts per million in the atmosphere. And I point out that this calculation is from IPCC equations. This isn't something that I've just dreamed up or somebody else dreamed up. This is from a reference that the IPCC has. And this is using Modtran data, Modtran to calculate it. From 1958 to 2010, here we are. And here is the projection based on the logarithmic. And then here's what the models say. So clearly, we are going to be seeing not a straight up linear increase, but we're going to see a smaller increase based on the fact that carbon dioxide is a logarithmic effect. Now, if you'll excuse me just a moment, I have to live with one of my problems. I wear 2 hearing aids. I'm 85% deaf, and that's due to sensorineural loss from ototoxic reaction to drugs when I was a child. I had a series of ear infections. And my hearing aid battery just died in the middle of this presentation. Murphy's Law in action. So I have to replace it.
Probably caused by global warming.
That's better. I can hear you now. I can hear me. Adaptation to climate change is probably far easier than resisting it or changing the way we live. And it's proof of that, proof of the adaptation going on. The death rates have gone down significantly over the last century. We have adapted to a warmer climate, we've adapted to disease, we've adapted to all sorts of things. We've adapted to severe weather, which is another subject which I may touch on if I've got time. But there's clear evidence that adaptation has already vastly reduced damage and death from existing climate change. A 98% reduction in the probability of death from drought, floods, and storms since the 1920s. And as a side note to that, Boston Harbor. If you look at maps of Boston Harbor from around the turn of the Revolution, it was much smaller and much more how would I say it, broad in some ways. It had a broader shoreline. There was lots of infill that's gone on. Now, sea level rise has gone up since the time of the American Revolution, but Boston Harbor has stayed ahead of that, just like New York has. Adaptation is a natural process that humans interact with. We just do it, and we don't think about it. And so the inundation of sea level is probably not a big worry. Climate and future generations. Nobody in the past worried about financing a future climate. I cannot see why this generation should bear the cost of damage that will not become apparent, if it happens, until the time of a far richer future generation, any more than people in 1900 should have made sacrifices to make people today slightly richer. Or why today poor should subsidize through their electricity bills today's rich who receive subsidies for wind farms, which produce less than 3% of our country's electricity. Steve Gorham covered a lot of this here. Fossil fuels are going to take a long time to go away. We can't just shut them off right now. We wouldn't be here talking about it today. In fact, our CO2 emissions in the United States have gone down significantly. And not much of it had to do with green technology or solar power or wind power. Most of it has to do with the fact that we've had a shale gas revolution. Yet China continues to soar in its emissions while the United States goes down. So since global warming is a global problem, how do we deal with the fact if we shut our own economy down and stunt it, what are we going to do about China? No one's really addressed that issue well. From 1949 to today, U.S. renewables have increased from 9.3% to just 9.4%. They're basically flat. There's not a lot of change. And fossil fuels have dropped from 90% to 82% in 2011, only because nuclear has increased. What we really need is a better nuclear program, that's my opinion. We should be on to a thorium reactor program. If climate change is an issue, let's assume it is, a thorium nuclear program is the way forward. We're only in a uranium and plutonium nuclear program because it just coincided with bomb making. Otherwise, we could have gone into thorium, and China is actually doing that now. They have a thorium reactor program in place. Okay, the integrity of the surface temperature record. My surface stations project found significant biases, and I'm going to show you some of them. As you know, we went out and photographed weather stations all over the United States, 1,221 of them. This is one of them we found. This is in Waterville, Washington. This is a vehicle radiator hood here. Volcanic cinder, parking lot, convenient banking right here. This is where they're measuring climate change. It wasn't like this 20 years ago. The station moved. Here's a station in Urbana, Ohio. There's the sensor right there on a brick wall. This is a water treatment plant. These are where the effluent comes in, and they have these grates and screening things here, and concrete. It gets shadowed, and all kinds of problems here. I mean, literally, the thing is a hot spot. Then there's this strange thing here, this refrigeration unit. And when the observer, the volunteer sent me this photo, I looked at that and I said, why is there a refrigeration unit out there? I mean, are they cooling the sewage or something? What's going on? So I called up the water treatment plant manager and I asked him about this. Why do they need a refrigeration unit out here? And he said, and I quote, it's because when the guys work on the equipment out here, it's so darn hot they have to have a refrigerator or they'll faint. I kid you not. This is where we measure climate. And there's lots of other water treatment plants in the United States where temperature is being measured. And when you look at them in infrared, the air temperature that day when I stood on this highway overpass and took these two photos was at 32, 0 C. But the temperature of the plant effluents is much warmer. And as you can see, they release the heat into the air. Is this a place where we should measure temperature? Well, maybe temperature, but climate over the long term? Probably not. The reason that it's a place like a sewage treatment plant is when the U.S. Weather Bureau commissioned the surface network back in 1892, when it was all done on paper forms, it was done as a tool to aid in forecasting. How much rain did we get over here? Did it match our forecast? Basically was the premise of it. Temperature also, was our temperature forecast accurate? But they had to put them into a place where people could write down on these forms every day of the week. And so the places that were chosen were places that were manned. Police stations, fire stations, ranger stations, and sewage treatment plants, because stuff doesn't stop. This is the fire station in Oklahoma. It's right between the sidewalk and the curb where they park the vehicles. And again, infrared there. Not a good place to measure temperature or climate because it's biased. Here's one in Wickenburg, Arizona. Same problem. Right next to a concrete wall. Anyone who's ever stood next to a concrete or brick wall after sunset, you know you can feel the heat radiating off of it. This elevates the T-min, the minimum temperature overnight, which elevates the T-mean by the calculation, which makes it appear that it's warmer. This one in Baltimore, Maryland, at the National Weather Service Forecast Office on the roof. It's since been closed. And it's been closed because the Weather Service did a study and found that the Baltimore roof had 13 new records where there were none in surrounding areas. 10 co-op stations, National Airport, Baltimore, all these different places didn't have temperature records, but this one place did. And they recognized this and closed this. And in fact, all those stations that I've shown you have since been closed. Dozens of stations have been closed around the United States because I highlighted the embarrassing situation of them. They don't tell us about it. I find them out later when they all of a sudden have disappeared from the record. Bainbridge, Georgia, near parking, air conditioner, and shading. What are we really measuring there? Air conditioning units in Wilbur, Washington. Again, what are we measuring there? Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, air conditioning units. They've got the Stevenson screen, the original, and then they've got the new MMTS here. Interesting story about the Stevenson screen. It was moved there. It actually was way out over here a long time ago. This is a rail for the radio station. This is the radio station where it's at. And this is the rail out to the transmitter. There's transmitting towers way out there. And this, as you can see here, is kind of swampy land. They moved the weather station because the radio station manager saw mercury in the thermometers and thought, if someone breaks it out here in this swampland area, I'm going to have a hazmat, situation on my hand. So they picked it up and moved it. They moved it here. This is the kind of stuff we find. This is probably the worst example of sighting in our whole history. This is in Tucson, Arizona. This is at the University of Arizona at Tucson. This is operated by their atmospheric sciences department. I kid you not, there's a plaque right there that says this is operated by the atmospheric sciences department. This is an official place where they measure temperature in the middle of a parking lot. And the reason it's there is because the university kept growing and growing and growing, and there was no more places left to put the weather station. The building would get put over here. Oh, the weather station's there. You got to move it over here. They move it over here, and there's another building getting built. And they kept moving it. And they were playing musical chairs with this weather station. It finally ended up in the parking lot where they thought they couldn't move it anymore. This station has also been closed. And this one here is just comical. Hanksville, Utah, USHCN, climate station of record. I point out to you this. That is a tombstone. I kid you not, a pioneer woman is buried there from the migration west in the 1850s. And the reason that the tombstone is underneath the weather station is because, again, I called up to find out, why did you do this? And it was because it used to be over here somewhere, he said, but they kept tripping over the gravestone on the way out in the dark winter mornings. Seriously. And so, okay, let's put the weather station over the gravestone, and that way we won't trip over it. Perfect logic, right? But this is a heat sink. Ugh. Okay, the results of our study showed basically only 1 in 10 of the weather stations used to measure climate around the United States over the last 100 years have acceptable sighting by NOAA's own standards. 1 in 10. That's a sobering thought. And the errors associated with them, for the ones that are unacceptable, the class 3, 4, 5s, can range between 1 and 5 degrees centigrade. We analyzed the trend data from these stations, and this is what I found. Now, if we assume that the class 1 and 2 stations, which are considered acceptable, again, by NOAA's own standards, we're using their standards to rate this, consider them to be acceptable and assign them a 0 baseline point, and look at the rest of them, we find that they have significant differences in the trend. This is the decadal temperature trend, temperature per decade. And we find this no matter how we bin it, whether we bin it by equipment, by state, by region, whether it's agricultural, non-agricultural, urban, non-urban, this signal will not go away. We believe it's a ground truth. And we're getting ready to publish a paper on it. Now, we started publishing a paper last year. I put it out on the web. Got some excellent feedback. We found an issue, and that issue we had to deal with. We spent the last year going over all the paper forms that are put out by the observers to figure out how to deal with it. We came up with an elegant solution. We reanalyzed it, and I'm happy to say that our conclusion has not changed, and we'll be publishing that soon. This is what we published last year, and basically this says the compliant thermometers, class 1 and 2, say that we have a temperature trend of about 0.15 centigrade per decade. The non-compliant thermometers, just by themselves, have a trend of about 2.5 C per decade, a quarter of a degree centigrade per decade. And then after NOAA goes through with their homogenization and adjustment processes and adjust the poor station to equal the bad station and doing other things, they come up with 0.3 of a degree. Again, it's a construct. It's not real. And we're going to be able to show why this is in our paper. So in summary, the temperature trend is not alarming. Amplification feedbacks are not evident. We haven't seen significant aerosol issues, even though they're claimed to be there. Arctic sea ice isn't global. Antarctic's going up, and it may very well be soot and other factors in the Arctic, ocean current possibly. The failure of the models to predict the pause is confirmed. They don't. They can't predict 5 to 10 years out. Climate sensitivity is likely low. Adaptation to changing climate is in fact possible. We've done it. We're doing it. Climate and future generations may not need our help after all. Reducing emissions isn't being done worldwide because China and India are surging ahead while we're cutting back. And the integrity of the surface record creates almost a doubling of the temperature trend, an artificial temperature rise. When we look at the best stations, it's about half. Finally, you might make the argument that even a very small probability of a very large and dangerous change in the climate justifies drastic action. That's basically the argument today. But I would reply that a small probability of a very large and dangerous effect from the adoption of large-scale renewable energy, reduced economic growth through carbon taxes or geoengineering also justifies some caution. At the moment, it seems the cure is worse than the disease, and basically, we're taking chemotherapy for a cold right now. Thank you very much. I have a real problem. Jeremy?
Yes.
Can you, I'm probably going to need you to, when you turn his microphone on, come up here and interpret for me, because not only did I lose a hearing aid battery, but it's so humid here compared to where I am in California that everything sounds like a mumble. And so I'll probably have to have him interpret questions for me, because I was trying to listen to questions earlier, and I had a real problem with it. And I apologize for that, but that's just my life. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for mentioning Matt Ridley. Can you hear me? Okay. Matt Ridley is my favorite science columnist in the Wall Street Journal. If you read the Wall Street Journal, check for him every Saturday in the special section. Last Saturday, July the 6th, his column was about climate change. What he said was, there's no global warming, the models are wrong. If we want to look at climate, we should study the sun, and that's it. So Matt Ridley has caught on to the farce. Thank you very much for that. The other one is adding even more to your argument about the siting of weather stations. A large percentage of the weather stations in the United States are at airports. They were put there 40, 50, 60 years ago when the airport was 5 miles outside of the city. The cities have grown. The urban heat island effect that you showed so brilliantly has now put the weather stations in areas where it's 1 or 2 degrees temperature higher than it was 50 years ago. That's another artificial trend which is giving a complete bias to the measurements. Thank you very much.
The urban heat island is definitely a real issue, although it's been tried to make, and they try to make it go away. Recently there was a study, which you can find on my blog, about Korea. People in Korea did a study of UHI and found that UHI had been responsible for a good portion of their warming over the last century. And people are slowly coming around to realize this. The idea that UHI contributed to global warming, they would put in very small numbers like 0.05 or whatever. They basically poo-pooed it as not significant. And there were studies after studies that came up and said that UHI isn't a real effect. But a lot of those studies were done where they didn't even go there and take measurements. These were done on statistical analysis of data. I did a transect of Reno, Nevada, for example, which is on my blog in 2008 or 9, which showed clearly that it exists. UHI exists, and the growth of UHI is what contributes to the trend.
The trouble I have with the skeptical approach is that it requires something specific to be skeptical about. And I find the catastrophic warming proponents are always changing their arguments. I wonder if there's somewhere specific that you look to see what their case is in order to argue against it.
What was, I didn't get all that. Speak loudly.
He was saying that the global warming proponents, the proponents of catastrophic warming, are always changing their arguments.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that? How can you argue against them when they're always changing their arguments?
Okay, you're right. They have been changing it. It was global warming, and then it was climate change, and then it was climate disruption, and now it's extreme weather, and a phrase they're using is called poisoned weather. And they're doing that because the models and the temperature aren't working. Clearly, they're grabbing at straws there. They're trying to keep it alive. And now we're back to where we were during medieval times when we were afraid of witches and warlocks changing the weather, you know. They're trying to make us afraid of the weather. They're making us afraid of the weather by saying it's happening more frequently, it's happening more severely, it's happening in a different way than it happened 50 years ago. My argument against that it's weather and not climate, is this. Think about the timeline of technology. 150 years ago, we didn't have the telegraph. We had horseback riders, we had wagon trains, we had word of mouth. News moved very slowly. Then we got the telegraph and trains. News sped up. And then we had radio around the turn of the 20th century into the 20th century. And all of a sudden we heard about the news of the Titanic disaster within minutes, hours of it sinking. And then we got television in the early 50s. And all of a sudden people could see as well as hear or read. And things started becoming covered live around the globe when we got satellites in the early 60s. And now you could watch a president speak overseas, or you could see the Vietnam War happening live, things we couldn't do before. And then in the early 1990s, the internet kicked in. And now people could start contributing to that. And then we got cell phones with cameras. And now we have millions and millions of cell phones with cameras out there, photographing weather events as they happen. 100 years ago, if a tornado happened in the middle of a cornfield in Kansas, would we have known about it? But now, we've got storm chasers, 24-hour news, cable, phones, all this stuff, and if a tornado is happening in a cornfield in the middle of Kansas, it's on CNN right now. We didn't have that. And so there's this appearance that weather has gotten worse, but really it's a reporting bias. And it's the same way when we look at the data with tornadoes. The number of large damaging tornadoes, the F3s to the F5s, has gone down actually over the past 30 years or so. But the number of small tornadoes has gone up, and that's because we're seeing them more often. We've got Doppler radar now, which kicked in the early 90s. We can see the small tornadoes on radar. We can send people there to verify it. We couldn't do that before. And the most interesting thing about all of this is despite the fact that we've got millions of extra cameras and eyes out there being able to report instantly and send it to CNN or whatever, we still haven't gotten any good pictures of UFOs and Bigfoot. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Harrison Brundage, retired geologist, Houston. I'm very interested in your data from Hawaii. You mentioned Mauna Loa, and one reason I'm very skeptical of any CO2 concentration in information from Hawaii is the fact that we have an active volcano there at Kilauea. Now,
Right.
do you have any comments on the wind currents that take the carbon dioxide one direction or another, and how that affects their concentration of CO2 in Hawaii on that station there?
Okay, I looked into this. I understand what you're talking about. Mauna Loa is a volcano. You think, oh, why would they put a CO2 monitoring station on a volcano? It makes no sense. It does in a way, and let me explain. First of all, I believe those observations, and I believe them because I've talked to the people who do those observations. I've looked at the equipment, I've looked at the procedures, and I believe they're valid. They do have a wind sensing system, and the only time that the CO2 concentration on top of Mauna Loa is enhanced by the volcano itself is when we get certain wind patterns. During those times, they do not make observations. They only make observations when the conditions are right. The reason for it being on top of Mauna Loa is because of its placement. In the middle of the ocean, we've got a well-mixed atmosphere at high elevation, and it gives us a much better perspective away from industrialization and urbanization, which also contributes to CO2. So in the United States, we have higher CO2 levels, near cities and so forth, than we do in the middle of the ocean. The ocean gives us a better reading. And I believe that data not only because of their procedures, but also because it correlates well with other sites where CO2 is measured around the world in similar conditions.
Yeah, I would also be skeptical of weather data from Mexico if they put it on top of Popocatépetl. Thank you.
All righty.
Well, I'm really enjoying this again, all the presentations. I just want to make a quick comment about the reference that we're going to end up a horse and buggy society if we don't turn this around. The animal radical people are not going to let us do that either, so.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Let me help you with a response to Dr. Wildowski's questions about how do you manage your skepticism when the catastrophe or the disaster changes every
Can you
year.
speak a little closer to the mic, please?
Sorry. Dr. Wildowski asked, how do you change your skepticism when the disaster changes every year? And the answer was furnished by one of Obama's advisors who said, you have to take advantage of every catastrophe. The point is, they change the catastrophe every year because the commonality and the constant is the desire to take power over you and use these ideas to take away your freedom and get more of your money.
Just a historical note about the soot on snow. Benjamin Franklin did that 200 years ago.
What do you say?
Benjamin Franklin did an experiment with soot on snow 200 years ago.
He did that. I did not know that. I'll look that up. Thank you. That's something I want to blog about.
We did it in Pittsburgh in 1950.
Really? Okay.
That's where I live. We put snow, soot all over the
All right.
snow, and it disappeared the next day.
That was
Okay.
the Franklin Institute. Bad joke. Just to reinforce your idea of adaptation, it's already happening all over the world. Most people live in urban areas now and have been, and as you showed again, the temperature's going up in urban areas. We ourselves have lived through a temperature increase of 1 to 2 degrees in our own entire lifetimes and have adapted to it unconsciously. And that's happening all over the world.
Right. Okay. Thanks, everybody.